Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Trivett, and I'm an archivist. And this is another episode of An Archivist Tale, a podcast created by my husband, Jeff Huth, and me. Hi, Jeff.
Hello, Karen. And so I'm happy to be here today. It's been a long time since I've been in my apartment. It's been a matter of weeks so far.
That you've been here.
Yeah, we haven't. I've almost never left.
Almost.
And so and this is the interesting thing because right now we have started this whole new way of podcasting for way to reach people, but also so that we can talk to people during the pandemic and seeing how it's affecting people, especially in the New York metropolitan area, which has been particularly badly hit. But
Absolutely.
we've also talked to people from Kansas, from Ecuador, and so thanks for coming. Thanks for seeing and
Yes.
listening.
Yes. Today is April 25th, 2020, which is Saturday, and it is exactly 11:10 in the morning Eastern Time.
Nice.
And we are coming to you from 1 West Street in Manhattan. And with that, I'm going to say welcome to our guest. We are very pleased to have him with us, and I'll ask him to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. I'm a professor at the Palmer School of Library and Information Science at Long Island University and have been an archivist since the mid 70s. So I'm happy to chat today about the past, present, and future of archives.
We're so happy to have you. Thank you again for joining us. So, Greg, let's just dive in. Tell us, what is your archivist origin story?
Okay, so my origin story, as I say, starts in the mid 70s. I was a graduate student at New York University in the history program, and at that time, NYU got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to establish the first archives education program in the New York City area. So the first class was all the people who were already in NYU, and I was fortunate to be the first graduate of that archives program.
Wow.
Afterwards, was hired by the United Negro College Fund, which was headquartered in New York, and worked there for 7 years as a kid from the Bronx, an Irish kid from the Bronx. Archives put me in contact with folks I never would have met, including people like Benjamin Mays, who was the inspiration for Martin Luther King Jr., just a whole part of society that I just never would have been in contact with. And it was years later, as editor of the American Archivist, I received an article from Alex Poole called The Strange Career of Jim Crow Archives. And only at that time, when he was talking about segregation in the South and how archivists and historians work together, did I really understand what some of the historians I met at UNCF had gone through in their career 20 years earlier. So it was a nice way of coming full circle and finishing the archival origin tale by understanding more about the people I never would have met had it not been for a career in archives.
That's so exciting. But I'm also curious, how did you get the allure to study a graduate program in archives?
Uh, as I said, there were a few of us who were there already. NYU got the grant, and my recollection is they had to form a class quickly. So
Mm-hmm.
that was the history department that did this, and really our education program was a patchwork of courses that already existed. So unlike what myself and others who are teaching archives now are trying to do, we took an existing course in the Museum Studies program. We took an existing
Mm.
course at the Institute of Fine Arts near the Metropolitan Museum, and they cobbled all this together and called it an archival education program, which evolved over time to be a fabulous one. But we really, it was sort of like a chance to sample other disciplines as in our program. But so there was
Mm-hmm.
nothing special. I think I knew about archives, but had never thought about a career. My plan was probably to teach history at the graduate level, but there was the 70s was another time where there weren't many jobs to teach history in universities. So it all worked out well and has been a wonderful career since then.
Had you used archives or special collections in your own research?
I had, and that actually helped me to get my internship. I was doing work on the history of banking at a time when then Chase Manhattan Bank, now J.P. Morgan Chase, had one of the early business archives programs in the city. So that
Oh, wow.
connection enabled me to get an internship at Chase with Linda Edgerly, and really
Oh,
to
wow.
I had the internship before I really had many courses. So when I actually got to the on-campus internship, that was pretty easy because I knew from Linda what to do already.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. That's awesome.
It's kind of interesting. So that first class, I'm not sure if we've talked to anybody in that first class, but how many people were in it, in the
Yeah.
program at the time?
Uh, Probably about half a dozen. The
Oh,
other person
really?
everyone would know who was in there was Peter Wosh, who
Oh,
So
so,
Peter,
so Peter
ah,
went to the American Bible Society and then taught at NYU. He and I and a couple of other folks were in that first class. So
wow,
wow.
wow, that's
That's
pretty
rich.
good. Kind of interesting. Peter, by the way, I keep repeating this. He's the most mentioned person on our podcast. For some reason, he always comes up, and it could be people from anywhere. I don't know why. I suppose if you teach for so long, you come up. Your name comes up for the same
yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
So, but one of the reasons to have you on is all of the things that you've been doing.
Mm.
And so rather than have one of us choose what to talk about, we want you to, decide where you want to start, what tale you want to tell next.
Sure. I guess what I might do is walk through, as your hair gets the color of mine, you reflect back on things, how you got to where you are now. So uh, I'll step through some things I've been involved with over the years, and then we can focus on whatever you want. You know, at UNCF, the fund there was starting an archives. They had no archivist. So
Mm.
that wound up being a real pleasure to do. After UNCF in the mid 80s with a growing family, I found out that records management in a corporate sector paid a little better. So I spent 7 or 8 years as a manager of corporate records for ITT World Headquarters. And again, saw the connections between archives and records management, and actually got certified as a records manager in that stretch. Right at the end of that time was the formation of the Academy of Certified Archivists. And as a 35-year-old, I still don't know how it happened, but I was elected the first president of ACA and had a similar challenge of starting something from scratch. So there's this theme that seems to pick up that I wind up doing things like that. Uh, After that, 1990, I was hired at Long Island University, which had no formal archival education program, so was able to build that from scratch. I guess maybe I'm not good at a place where something already exists, uh, I've been doing that since 1990. The mid, starting in 2004, uh, I got a call from the folks at Lockheed Martin saying they needed an archivist and an historian to serve on the team that was building the electronic records archives for the National Archives. So never wanted to turn down an opportunity to do something that no one's tried before. Uh, I agreed to be a
Mhm.
member of that team and spent 6 years, in addition to full-time teaching, working on the development of the ERA. I would teach 2 classes on Monday night, take the first flight to Washington on Tuesday, come back with the last flight Thursday night, and finish up with my final class Saturday morning. It's a good thing I was younger then. Uh, and then after that, starting in 2012, I decided to see if I could have a second job working as editor of the American Archivist, and spent 6 years as editor of the American Archivist, trying to expand the pool of peer reviewers and expand the voices that were in the journal. And the final piece in terms of, well, before the final piece, also when I was teaching, I came to the conclusion that there really wasn't a good one-volume book about archives that I could use in class. That the SAA manuals were wonderful, but putting them all together was kind of expensive. So in the late 90s, I decided I'd write one of those things, which doesn't sound hard until you try doing it. And the third edition of that book has just come out. So that I'm trying to encapsulate theory and practice in 300 pages. Um, so, so again, that's something that was a challenge. And the final thing in the journey that I wanted to mention in terms of doing something that hadn't been done before is that on campus a couple of years ago, we came up with the idea of trying to help local historical societies on Long Island. There are over 100 of them. And we were able to submit to a grant to the Gardner Foundation, Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, which does a lot of local history in the New York area. And they gave us $1.5 million to digitize materials in local historical societies. We found no model for this nationally. So all of the work is done by students. This semester I had 16 master's students and 3 PhD students doing the work. And we have portable digitization labs, 6 of them we send out in the field, and a $60,000 digitization system that we bought on campus to do the difficult things. And our target is to get to 80 historical societies by the end of our grant, and we've done over 40 already. So again, that was my nature has never been just to keep going with whatever it is I'm doing. So if I can build something, try something different, and that was a huge initiative. And the final thing that started a year after that was, again, the Gardner Foundation asked us if we could figure out some way to make the archival legacy of Robert Moses on Long Island available to the public. And okay, so we'll try to figure something out. So they gave us $700,000, and this grant is a partnership where the Gardner Foundation funded it. LIU, I'm responsible for the grant. I have 2 full-time people as well as 2 interns. It's a partnership with the Long Island region of New York State Parks because they're their records. We're arranging, describing, and we'll digitize their records for them, and the digitized images will be hosted on the New York State Archives website. So it's his legacy, Robert Caro's bio. As we're finding different things, we're looking in the index of the Caro book, which is our Bible, and they're not there. So as best we can tell, they are processing 422 cubic feet of records that have not been available for research before. So so that's the litany of things where I like a challenge. I like building something. I like trying to structure things, and that's a quick dash from the mid-70s onto these 2 projects that are really just wonderful to do now, and especially to give my students opportunities with the hands-on experience that I think will be unparalleled for them as they compete in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing that comes to my mind is you've seen this dramatic shift of analog to digital product and practice, and I'm wondering, how would you describe that transition?
Well, I really was a part of the shift because when I was at ITT Corporation, one of the things they hired me to do was to manage an in-house microfilming operation, which I knew nothing about. So I had to learn that to manage it, and the only way I could manage it, I learned how to not only make microfilm, but process it, duplicate it. The only way I could manage it personally was to make sure I understood it. And we were at that time starting with pilot digitization projects at ITT in the late 80s. So the shift has been quite dramatic. And but what I'm finding is, as dramatic as that shift has been, working with local historical societies, the shift is not universal.
Right.
You know, that the historical society folks who are so committed to this are some of them don't have email, and I always feel young when I'm at the historical society. But one of the things that I do want the next generation of archivists, my students, to understand by having them work with people who are so passionate about history, I also want them to know that though we're in a digital world and we're using Preservica as to make the images available and accessible over time, that much of their work, especially if they're interested in community archives, is still going to be helping people with their analog materials and making the management choices, the strategic choices about what to bring into the digital environment. So but the analog experience has been foundational. It's the same kind of questions we ask, and the archivists are still, I tell my students when we do a class where I do show and tell on microforms, I let them know you're going to inherit these. You need to know what they are, even just so that you can do that job when you're faced with a box full of this stuff.
Yeah.
Right, and know what to
Yeah.
do. So meaning, I hate microfilm. I hate all micrographic formats, and the reason is that virtually nobody figured out how to make them well. When I worked with unions, I had the biggest union in the state, and I'm looking at the microfilm they produced. First, they chose 16 millimeter, real as high resolution as they could get. Second, they were virtually unreadable. It was like looking at muddled mud, and that was all that it was. I mean, like, did you not think of anything when you have people? Local governments had done hundreds of thousands, millions of rolls of microfilm, and then I find them sometimes literally being stored on a radiator. What are you thinking? We go into, I've seen vinegar syndrome so bad that it was causing lesions on somebody's skin. And these are only the worst things about it, and there's so many other ones. However, if done well, it's sturdy, it's stable, it's long lasting, it's foolproof, but there are just a lot of fools that are smarter than foolproof. But that's a good thing to do, because I learned, like you, a lot about microfilm. I learned some in school from Bill Safety, but I learned a lot having to do it, because my first job, I had to run a microfilm program as well. And so we were very interested in quality and storage and following standards and all of this. And people need to know this, because they need to know what they might be able to do and what they can do. The only good thing now is that we can actually digitize microfilm and maybe improve it sometimes. But sorry, microfilm puts me on a rant. I was the one who, when I came into my new job, I just said, I am not supporting microfilm. I will not pay for it. And the reason I won't pay for it is, if you microfilm something today, 10 years from now, you're going to want to scan it. And then if you want to scan it, you're just going to cost us another set of money, and it doesn't make any sense.
Well, but that's why I'm stressing the hands-on digitization, because I don't want my students just to inherit digital objects without understanding what's going on. And throughout the grant project, I'm also letting them know, things that I would do differently now from when I got the grant 3 years ago. So I want them to see the administration side, not just the digital capture side. And I do say to them regularly, when you are setting up a digitization program, don't do some of the things that we did wrong. You should definitely learn, because I'm trying to let you know all of the experiences, and that's the kind of knowledge you'll be able to bring to the job down the road.
What were some of the challenges you would have faced differently?
Well, I think that, well, again, it's my approach to a project like this, as maybe what I should have done was ask for a year planning grant. And I decided, no, why should I waste a year? That I'm confident that we did hire a consultant to make sure we bought the right equipment and we had the right standards, so I wasn't just going to learn that much, but with the foundation of the right standards, the right equipment, the right procedures, we just plunged right in. And so there were, I think there was mainly some workflow and management things that I would have done differently. The standards were set. It's not as though we did something incorrectly, but I guess it was just more that I was more of an optimist. The equipment would arrive when it was supposed to, that it would be especially our system on campus would be as easy to run as it looks like on the manufacturer's site. But so that's what I've said to them. There may be advantages of a planning grant, but I just wanted to, there was so much need at the historical societies. I just wanted to jump right in and
Mm-hmm.
build the expertise as we went along, knowing that our productivity would improve and other things would happen. But to have lost 6 months or a year when I could have helped someone who, and the materials that we're finding are just fabulous, back into the 1600s that are in these small historical societies. To have lost the opportunity to have captured more of that, I think with all those projects previously, ACA, the Lockheed Martin project, I really had no opportunity to do a learning curve. With ACA, the election was done in the evening, and there was no running in advance for something or being elected before the meeting. The vote happened at the meeting, and then the next morning we had to figure out how to run something that hadn't existed until the night before. So
Well, it keeps it interesting.
Yeah.
And this is what sort of befuddles me, especially when people talk about records management. They talk about how boring it is, and I said, what the heck is boring about it? You're trying to solve people's problems. You're trying to manage information so it gets to the right people at the right time. And so you know where things are. It should be always keeping your brain going and keeping it interesting. Seems to me that's why you do all these
yeah,
things.
and well, digital records don't give us the opportunity to find records management boring. Whether we think it is or not, we're not going to get the digital archives unless we become engaged with records management professionals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is a big deal. I got mentioned in an article recently, Frank Bowles, and it was because in one piece I wrote for SAA, I said that we need to start appraisal as soon as possible, by which I mean before the creation of the records. And then Frank says that he thinks it might have just been a rhetorical statement. It's not a rhetorical statement. I literally have done that, meaning we have appraised records before they exist. I said, the example I give is if the state government says makes a law that creates a record, then we know why the records were created, what it does, what kind of information it has. We can appraise it before it exists, and we have done that. And so it's important to think as early as possible and be involved, because the old model doesn't work. The old model was, well, wait till everybody dies or everybody retires and then try to figure out what's going on.
Well, essentially, what you're doing is you're establishing those values or recognizing the value of the business process early on.
Mm-hmm.
So that records born out of the business process are naturally appraised at whatever value you assign them.
Right.
Is that fair to say?
Sure. But also, you also have a system by which you know where the record should go at some point in time.
Right.
And so one kind of disposition is just transfer to the archives, but nobody thinks of that as disposition most of the time. And that's one of the things we should always be thinking in all of those terms.
And we reflected that in our curriculum at Long Island University. When I was hired, so that's 1990, the two professions were still far enough apart that we established separate 15 credit certificates, one in archives, one in records management. And by about 1996, with digital records, we realized that wasn't the right approach for our students to keep these two things separate. So we combined them into an 18 credit certificate in archives and records management to make it easier to position, for the students to position themselves in the future. If they wanted to do records management, it wasn't as though they had a certificate in archives and vice versa. And then some of our classes could focus more broadly on records administration rather than having to look at it through the lens of just archives or just records management.
Right. Which is good. My life has always been bi or trifurcated, so I've always had different kinds of work I have to do at the same time, which to me is good, because if you can see the entire breadth of this information environment and see how it moves, then you can understand it better and you can make it work better and you can figure out how to get information to people better.
Greg, how would you describe the trajectory of the ACA? How has that looked and changed over time?
I mean, it's the experience during the first year was certainly atypical.
Mm.
You know, it's an organization, you know, that has developed as others have. The first year, we realized the next morning we were now there were four officers. The organization had not been incorporated by SAA. So our first realization was that the four of us were personally liable for decisions that we were making, including the fact that the interim board for certification had not, there were so many requests by petition that they were not all resolved, and the appeals were not all resolved. So we quickly realized that we had to divvy up responsibilities, and one of mine was to get this organization incorporated because I did like my house, and I didn't feel like losing that in a lawsuit about certification decisions. So the other thing that was unusual in the first year that people tend to forget is that SAA did have an interim board for certification for a few years that had set up the process, did the role delineation, built the exam. That first day practically that ACA was formed, we were presented with a bill from SAA for all those activities.
Wow.
So yes, everyone had paid their certification fees, which were supposed to last for, you know, a bunch of years, but we had to pay back the bill for SAA for everything that they had incurred in the certification process. So almost immediately, ACA had financial difficulties because once we paid back that bill, then the legacy that was supposed to last all those years just wasn't there. So you know, the ACA had to make some decisions early on about dues and other kinds of things after I was done. But the leadership of ACA, I think, has continued to make it relevant. The number of certified archivists indicates that, but it was, you know, something where at least we tried to make certain that everyone would be able to deal with the finances. We paid that bill that was due. We got this incorporated. We did some of those basic things in the first year that the leadership, that there was no one but the four of us. There was no steering committee. There were no regents. There was no nothing. Just four people waking up and saying, what do we do now? But I've just been thrilled with everything that's happened with ACA since then.
Well, that's good. But so I want to think a little bit more about the historical societies, just because in my career, I've had to work with a lot of historical societies for lots of reasons. They often held local government records on behalf of the local governments. They're often kind of tied to the county or the town in some way, even if they're not really part of it. And so, do you think this model that you have is a good solution for sort of protecting the resources in historical societies? And I say this, having come from many historical societies that are built from nothing except flammable materials. So if anybody even thinks about mortar, they say, well, I don't know about that. It can't burn.
So our model, the grant limits us to historical societies that are not a part of government in any way. So those that are officially in the village historian or in the town government, you know, we can't assist them. We also are not permitted to help public libraries, their local history collections, because again, they are government entities on Long Island. So we are dealing with the independent 501c3 historical societies that are largely volunteer run. And what's nice about our model, I think, is that we are providing the expertise to get materials digitized, but then we also are using the cloud-based version of Preservica to make certain that materials are protected off Long Island and in a way that the historical societies would never be able to afford. So the model of providing certain things for the historical societies, some digitization, while educating them about how digitization is done and should be done, uh, and also being the repository of last resort for the materials which they still own. I'm not building a collection. These are their materials. They control access, and but it's structured that way. The real advantage of this, and I think it'll apply to community archives more generally, is that when I go into each historical society that applies, and they in effect get free consulting around strategic direction. What I say to them is that I'm not here to digitize everyone's diaries. If diaries, where do you want to be in 5 years as an historical society? What will enable you to get there if we digitize it? There's one historical society that said we have some old employee newsletters and there are people interested in this topic worldwide. So if you could digitize those, we can crowdsource the description. There are other people who have, there's one historical society that really was the seat of a town government in the early 1700s, and pretty much people forgot that these records were there. So they have legal documents that no one has ever seen that relate to the names, the Long Island names that people would know from George Washington's spy ring, the Culper spy ring, and others. So I think the real advantage of the model is being able to go in and work with historical societies to try to get them to figure out where do they want to be. How will they bring in the next generation? How will they connect the community more broadly? And can our project help them meet those goals? We can't do everything for any historical society. We just, maybe if they keep giving us money, we'll get there eventually. But that I think is the key of this model, and how I think it could be useful in other parts of the country, because it's focusing on direction, approach, as much as a technique of digitization or digital preservation.
Do you see another book, perhaps, coming out of this experience?
Well, it's interesting. I did mention that the third edition of my archives book just came out. Long ago, I did another book on preserving digital information, and I'm kicking around the idea of doing a second edition. The third edition of the archives book was a complete rewrite, so it's not really a second edition. It's a new book with the old cover, but I'm kicking around the idea of doing a second edition of preserving digital information targeted for community archives, historical societies, the large institutions. There's plenty of guidance out there. It's wonderful. We don't need another book for them, but maybe this experience, that would be the way to do the second edition of preserving digital information, and really tailor it to the kinds of people I'm working with day in and day out in the historical societies.
Right.
Right. And as I noted, I think it's sort of essential. If you can get at least a good number of historical societies on Long Island to identify what they think are their most important records so that they have some way of being preserved in the case of a disaster, that's great. Because what I say about Long Island is, if you want to know where I want you to store a record on Long Island, nowhere.
Yeah.
I never want anything stored on Long Island. It just has too much danger. It's like we are right next to a museum. It's right on the water in the Hudson River and at the harbor. Another place I would not want to store anything. And a great institution with lots of important materials.
Yes.
But what you're helping to do is to make sure there's some way to save these things, and also save. There's all this stuff. Everybody thinks that everything big is going to be better. So wherever the big places are, the big bodies of records, always going to be the most important. First, it depends on what you're looking for, and second, it depends on a lot of other things. And what Long Island was the earliest settlements in the state, and so they tend to have much more in terms of 17th century records than the rest of the state.
Well, this project's all about partnerships. So one partnership that I'm very proud of is that the National Park Service heard about what we were doing, and they asked us if we could work together with them to address the specific needs on Fire Island.
Oh,
The National Seashore now has in its mission statement to work not just with the land heritage, but cultural heritage.
nice.
So we've established a partnership with the National Park Service where off-season we use their ferry terminal in Patchogue. And so far, 3 Fire Island Historical Societies have brought materials from over on the ferry to the ferry terminal. And my students scan the materials at the National Park Service site. And so there are a total of 17 communities on Long Island, on Fire Island, and there are a bunch that were not separately incorporated. So they now are working together, and they've set up a 501c3 for the 12 that didn't have historical societies. So they've partnered to establish a cooperative organization for historical preservation. National Park Service has cooperated by giving us the facility, and the Gardner Foundation is giving us the funding. So those models of how you extend what you're doing, I think that's, we're a small profession, we have to build partnerships, and especially some of those big, difficult goals that if we find ways to work together with others, and that I think is our future as a profession.
Yeah. So I want to ask something before we forget this, because we are in what might be the middle of the beginning of the end of a pandemic, and I'm wondering how this has changed your work, okay? And so and what you do with this project, with teaching, with everything.
Sure. Uh, with this digitization project, obviously, as I said, students are out in historical societies, they're on campus. I had thought this through probably about 2 weeks before they closed the campus about what to do. And because I couldn't have students digitize, but the digitization actually was ahead of our work in Preservica. So for this semester, I was able to shift all of the students to metadata enhancement in Preservica. Preservica, we put in basic metadata at the time of ingest, as the very colorful term that the digital archivists use. I tell my students I don't like that metaphor, the biological metaphor for adding things, because of the biological metaphor for removing things, over which I have no control. But anyway, so when we ingest, we do it with basic metadata. And so I've been able to have students continue with that for the rest of the semester, fill out their internship hours, be able to graduate. If we're not able to do on-campus digitization in the fall, I'm going to have to ask for a rollover of some funds, because it really doesn't, the students need to experience that. The Robert Moses project, again, it's 3 phases. They inventoried records, inventoried 2,500 cubic feet. We're in the middle now of arranging and describing the 400 of research value. Typically, we would do arrangement and then description, but they had done 6 months of arrangement, so they are working remotely for a couple of months doing the description. Archive staff to make sure everything is going to feed into the state archive system. So again, short term I could do that, but eventually you got to get back to the archival collection. In terms of teaching, I've taught online. I was one of the first ones at the Palmer School to do that, so I have been able to teach online and continue to do that. But it's the digitization project and the Moses project that it's kind of hard long term. Whenever I've taught online, I've taught the archives class both face-to-face and online. I try to have it a comparable experience. I use my book as, instead of having to lecture, and then do it all around case studies. So it's different in the asynchronous online environment, but it still works fairly well, I think. So with us, with teaching, it hasn't been, I'm still doing my 3 classes, which are close to wrapping up this semester. We'll do 2 classes in the summer online, so that all is going to continue, and we'll try to do the best job we can in terms of the best educational experience for our students, despite everything else that's uncertain in their lives.
Greg, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the journal, The American Archivist, and your work as editor of that journal. And first, before you speak, I want to say thank you for bringing me into that world. You invited me to be a reviewer, and I segued from that role to being on the editorial board. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful experience. So yes, please reflect on that work you did for American Archivists.
Sure. Starting out in 2012, I, as opposed to some of these other things I've mentioned, where I had to start from scratch, the journal was in great shape. After a series of editors, Mary Jo Pugh did the journal right before me, so I had the luxury of being able to say, what do I do with an organization that's already functioning well? Peter Drucker used to talk about this. If you're hiring a sales manager, it makes a difference whether you have a sales force that's working wonderfully or whether it's in disarray. And the manager you hire is very different. So in the case of the American Archivist, I could be the editor who could say, the journal is in great shape now. How do we bring in new voices? How do we make certain that the next generation of archivists is connected to scholarship and not just to social media? So one of the things I did do was to try to expand the peer reviewers. Instead of having 2 peer reviewers per article, I said, well, let's just do 3. And I will add new peer reviewers who are qualified and mentor them, work with them as they do their peer reviews, with the idea being that if someone has done peer reviews and they've seen under the covers of the professional literature, then maybe they'll write articles. And so that the peer review expansion was what I hoped would be an expansion of the voices of the profession. I am happy that in the last issue that I edited, there was an article that passed peer review. It got no special treatment by an undergraduate student. So I was thrilled to see that an undergraduate who was able to write an article that passed peer review and was published. So every issue I tried to celebrate the new authors, the new peer reviewers. When we get together at SAA for our lemonade toast to authors and peer reviewers, that was the best part, to hear from folks who were new to peer review, who had done a couple, and the experience energized them. And then when I would see people as well doing publishing articles. My approach always has been a little different. I was happy to have articles pass peer review dealing with an archival reading of Dracula, or the use of records in Hamilton, an American musical. I wanted the journal to be fun as well as scholarly, and I really wanted the journal to be something that, whether you were involved in the biggest theory, I'm sorry, that's my local fire company realizing that we're doing something here and deciding to make some noise so I don't forget them. But I wanted everyone to find some reason to pick up the journal. That if you were involved in practice at the moment or theory, there would be something in there. For that reason, I also changed things so that I didn't differentiate articles. Previously, some articles were identified as case studies or perspectives or research articles. And I said, no, let the readers determine what was important. If it's accepted, it's an article. The same standards for peer review for all articles. An article's an article. I'm not going to segment them to say these articles are more important than other articles. So those are some of the things I was trying to do. We also, in the middle of the process, had our online platform suddenly decide they were no longer interested in the archivist business, so had to come up with a new online platform and get that started. So those were some of the things that I recall the most. But what really was exciting was trying to get people energized about the journal, which has a unique spot because it does serve our organization as well as our discipline. And I didn't want anyone to feel that the journal was disenfranchising them because they had something new to say that wasn't being said before, they hadn't been published before, they were interested in
Mhm.
theory and it was publishing practice or vice versa. I also expanded the book reviews section so that we would have as many resources as possible before our readers. So it was a great 6 years. The editorial board was fabulous to work with. The authors, the peer reviewers. It was a ton of work. Anyone can ton of work, but it's very rewarding work. And my experience with the journal did help shape my approach to the third edition of my archives book quite
Mm,
dramatically.
Wow.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was saying that American Archivist is really the premier journal, really, for the world of English speaking archivists. Meaning, we already have more of them here, but also one of the things is we can get to it more easily. You can get to all except for whatever the last 3 years. Archivaria is the same. Some of the other journals you can't even get to, no matter how old they are,
Yeah.
and it's really problematic. I use it all the time, the online version, because I've been working on the dictionary of archives terminology with folks for 6 years,
Yeah.
and it's going to come out soon. And and this allows us to find terms, to see how they're used, to understand how the usage changed over time, and to actually demonstrate to the archivist world that, guess what? Sometimes a word means more than two things, and you're going to just have to get used to it because that's the way it
Yeah.
is. In just one example, archives, I identified 11 different senses, which more than doubles the amount previously that we identified. But it's a huge resource, and
Mm.
so all these. But I haven't read all the articles, so sometimes I just read part of them. But both of the articles you mentioned, the Dracula one, etc. Oh yeah, I've used those.
Yeah. I do want to mention and really thank the members of the Society of American Archivists. This happens because SAA's members in their dues have made this a priority. Other journals have gone to commercial publishers, which is one reason why the access is restricted. But the SAA members in their dues make a considerable investment in the peer review, the value added process, the copy editing of the journal, and then trying to make this as available as possible. So that really is, I hope that everyone who's paying SAA dues, will realize that what you've said, Jeff, is because of that real decision by the membership. And this is an expensive proposition, but I hope that the members will continue to see it having the value that it's worth that big chunk of money because it is a unique resource for all of us in the profession.
Yeah, it is, but it also to have that as a rule is so important because it shows that we're actually trying to adhere to our principles,
Mm-hmm.
which is access to information unless there's some reason why access should not be granted.
Yeah.
And so it really is a great thing. And I want to ask one little question just before we get to the last one, which is tell us something about, I remember that era, the ERA era, the Electronic Records Archive. It's it was an interesting time, watching you folks try to do that and seeing, how you were working with Lockheed Martin. And so tell us, just a little bit about that story because it's going to be an interesting one for the
Mm-hmm.
listeners.
Uh, yeah, that was that time period. My role, the Lockheed Martin people called me the Universal Translator. In that my job was to take what archivists were interested in having the system accomplish, bring it to the system designers, uh, and translate it that way. But then, as the system designers were coming up with potential solutions, bring it back to the staff at the National Archives and get the feedback on that. I also was the person who wrote did all the training materials and the online help for the Electronic Records Archives. It was a tremendously ambitious project. NARA was calling it its moonshot. Uh, and so they tried to make it Apollo 11 and not Apollo 13. But, but anything of that magnitude, I think as a profession, looking back on it now, we have to realize that the goal, the seeking, was advancing practice. Up until that time, there were great resources about digital preservation. There was a 1996 study that talked about preserving digital information. There was work that Luciana Duranti was doing with Interpares, but some of the systems that we have now just didn't exist then. The technology was not there in 2004. And so the original scope of work for the ERA was to preserve any record created now and in the future for the life of the Republic. So how you break that into increments, what you deliver this year and next year, was always one of the more interesting things. So the goal was huge, the task was huge, the intellectual energy in it was tremendous in terms of trying to think this through. In particular, one thing I do want to mention that we put in from our side was something that we called the Council of Experts. So we got a half dozen of the best minds in archives and records management on that council. Elizabeth Atkins, Lee Stout, Bob Williams from Cohasset Associates. We tried to get the best people we could, and we asked them to use this opportunity to think through how things would be done in the ideal, the best way. Certainly, both sides did not necessarily implement all of that, but one of the best experiences from my perspective was getting that group of people together twice a year to look at what was being done and to blue sky what should be different. But then also, how would I implement this in my shop? So the whole exercise was a fabulous one. The road was a difficult one because of trying to do all of this, but I still think we got close to the moon on this. I know that NARA since then has been expanding, refining, rethinking, reconceptualizing. I will just mention one last thing about the ERA, that a lot of the work was done at a place called Rocket Center, West Virginia, which is where the federal government does quite a bit of its data processing. And I was sent out there one time. I was writing the user guide for correcting errors, but I didn't have security permissions to see what the error was. But anyway, I had to go out there to talk to people who had the clearance to see the error so I could write up a guide explaining it. But I had transposed a number in the address in Rocket Center, which was it was a federal complex. So I knocked on the wrong door. I think that it was one of the intelligence agencies. It was a long time before someone came out to answer the door to point me to where the archives work was happening. So I was sweating quite a bit before I arrived with that, but it just shows the level of seriousness of the archival enterprise in this regard, that what was happening in the ERA was being done in the same place where some of the most sensitive work at the federal level was also happening. So, but it was it was a tough 5 years, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. To have, if someone says to you, "Do you want to be involved in something like this?" There was no way to say no.
Well, Greg, you've talked about a lot of passions today, but I'd like to ask you, what keeps you passionate about all the kinds of work you do?
Well, I think that I got interested in this because history is the story of people. I was never really interested in movements and statistics and eras. That the United Negro College Fund work was all about people whose lives were changed by the historically black colleges and universities. So it's the stories of people, and on Long Island, this grant project has enabled me to get back to preserving the stories of people. We digitized the ledger of a physician who walked around a village in the 1830s and had a little pocket diary. We've digitized uh, the journals of a blacksmith and everyone that he was making, his chains for. We've digitized whaling ship logs, and one of my students who was trying to do the metadata said, "I think this person was dyslexic." And I looked at it and I said, "I think you're right. Before this would have been known, uh, naturally they gave the log to keep to the person with dyslexia, which made it very difficult for us to do metadata. But again, it's another story that we've told. On Fire Island, we're digitizing the photographs of community members who have passed away because of AIDS, and we're making certain that story is told and their lives are not lost. So what keeps me going, what keeps me passionate about this, is that archivists are in the unique place to tell the stories, to understand the stories, to make certain that individual lives are commemorated. And the more that we do that, as long as I can find ways to keep doing that, I think that I'll have the passion for this, and we'll hang around actively in the profession a while longer.
Well, we'll be the luckier for it.
Yeah, you seem like a person who doesn't want to retire.
Well,
But
my CIA account is saying don't retire now as well, but
come on. It is a problem, but this is something that your little sort of panegyric to archives just then made me think of, which is, what do you think is going to happen? It's been, when I came into the field, there were many fewer archivists than there are now. We have quite a few, and even and in more places. But we're going through what's probably an historic uh, twofer, meaning we have a massive pandemic of real serious proportions, though it's not affecting the entire country in the same way. And then we have also what looks like the possibility of a financial meltdown worldwide. And what are your thoughts on what the future might be for archives in such a world?
well, I guess if I get this question right, I can graduate to cable news probably. Thank you for
Oh,
thank you for the head start on that. But I guess as I think back in the 70s when I began in the profession, what a terrible time that was as well. I don't think it's not as terrible as this, but there were, NYU uh, built in an archival education program because there were no jobs for academic historians. So there had been not quite a meltdown, but all the jobs were filled by people who got there ahead of people my age. So I think there are lessons that or suggestions coming out of that, and I'm trying to do that with my students. One is maximum flexibility. Learn about archives, learn about records management, get your library degree, maximum flexibility. The other is skills. This digitization project, working with Preservica, when my graduates go out there, I want them to be able to think deeply about archives. I want them to be able to converse about the literature at the archival cocktail parties, but I want them to be able to do archives, and I'm old-fashioned that way. I want my graduates to be the ones that people are hiring because, yes, they have a long-term perspective, but now they can help us in the institution. So I guess I have to have faith as a humanist as I am, that if I can do that with my students, with the next generation of archivists, if they're flexible, we don't know the organizational structures, we don't know necessarily how they and where they will be working. But in the 70s, when I started, I think NYU believed that all archivists would be hired by big institutions, that we would all go to the National Archives, we would go to the Library of Congress. After that was the explosion of lone arrangers. one-person archivists working in a variety of settings. I don't think that they anticipated that in 1975, but that's what happened to the profession then. So I don't know what will happen to the profession. None of us do moving forward, but with the right set of skills and long-term thinking based on the scholarship, I'm hoping that however it evolves, that that I'm a little prejudiced. I want my graduates to be there in the profession doing that, but I'm confident that the profession will be able to continue to provide meaning to society in some way once we understand the new economics, the new organizational realities of this.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a great place to end. A nice positive note.
Yes.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, this ends another episode of An Archivist Tale. And stay tuned for other episodes from the middle of the pandemic.
Thank you, Greg.
Until next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Greg.